everyone, so this is our last in our series of videos based on living organisms in the ecosystem. And in this video, we're going to be focusing on three key things: ecological niche, food chains and food webs, and adaptations. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about, ecological niche. Now, ecological niche is the specific part in the habitat that the species occupies, because when we're talking about any habitat in general, so if you just go outside, you see that there's multiple species, but within the habitat itself the species have specific roles. So the ecological niche is encompassing the specific roles of the species, when that species is active, what type of food the species consumes. All of those are encompassed in the concept of the species ecological niche. And it's really where the species thrives. And what's really important about ecological niche is that you don't have two species that will have the same ecological niche, because if you have that, they're going to be competing for the same resources. So in the ecological niche, it includes the type of food that the species consumes. It includes its cycle of activity. So when we're talking about cycle of activity, where it interacts, when it interacts, is it a predator, is it a prey, does it have beneficial relationships with other species? That's what it means by cycle of activity. And what's extremely important is that only one species at a time can have a specific ecological niche. If you have two species that would have the same characteristics in the sense that eats the same food, hunts the same predators, active at the same time, what happens is it starts leading into a situation of competition. Now, two things can happen. One species overpowers the other. So you have one species that's driven to extinction and another species that basically remains in the niche. Or because of that competition, both of the species suffers and both of the species die off. So basically both scenarios are bad because of fighting for resources, because we need to remember that resources are finite. That means they don't last forever. And you can think of it as, let's say we had, for instance, two species that both ate grass. So I have one species, which is my bunny rabbit, and my other species, let's say this is a squirrel. So I have rabbit and I have squirrel. Now, if they both eat the same thing, so let's say they both eat grass. Now, grass can only grow at a certain rate. If both of my species are both eating grass, then eventually they're going to be eating more grass that is available. And if they don't have any other food source, and that's the only food source they have, well, what's going to happen is that both species are going to suffer. They're not going to have any food available, so that both species will eventually go extinct in that area. Now, sometimes, so basically they both went extinct. Sad. So, and that's what's really important when we're talking about ecosystems and we're talking about the different species that we have in them, because they have specific food sources, because they have specific times where they're active, you don't have an overlap. If there is an overlap, you will have competition and you will have species extinction. Food chains. Now, food chains is talking about the food relationship that you have between different species in a habitat. And we need to remember that we have 5 characteristics for all living things, and one of those characteristics is requires energy to function. So food chains are really tying into this concept of that all living things require energy to function. Now, within a habitat, you have a lot of different living organisms. You have producers that make their own food, which are plants. Then you have consumers, which consumes other organisms for food. And then you have decomposers that break down dead living matter. So producers make their own food. These are plants. Plants, by definition, in the animal kingdom are the group of organisms that produce their own food. And again, they do this by extracting energy from the sun and producing glucose. And that process is called photosynthesis. Now, the second main group of organisms in your food chain are consumers. And those are anything that eat others for food, which by definition is your entire animal kingdom. Now, we can actually subdivide what our consumers are based on what they eat. So herbivores are things that only eat plants. So when we're talking about herbivores, we're talking here about insects, and we have some mammals. So those would be like, rabbits, squirrels, squirrels. There's a whole bunch that are herbivores that eat plants. Now, we have organisms that only eat meat, and those would be considered carnivores. And then we have organisms that eat both plants and meat, and they would be omnivores. So examples of omnivores would be things like bears. They eat nuts, they eat fruit, and they also eat fish. Carnivores are anything that eat other animals, so you name it, foxes, wolves, etc. Now, our third category, and this category are called decomposers, and what they do is they eat dead organisms and they break them down into their basic components. So things like fungi are decomposers. You also have key insects that also act as decomposers. And when we're looking at a food chain, we're looking at one specific linear relationship. A food web would be all of the organisms in the ecosystem and the links between each one of them. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a basic food chain. Now, all food chains have to start with your producer because they are the first ones to take energy from the sun and change it into a form of energy that living organisms can use. And the chemical reaction that they do is called photosynthesis. So in photosynthesis, it's taking solar energy and it's converting it into food. Now, because our producer is the first organism on our food chain, it would actually be our first level, because when you have food chains, the number of organisms in your food chain determines what level of a food chain it is. So our producers are the basic. All food chains need to start with our producers. Now, the organism that eats the producer, all of these guys are going to be considered consumers. Now, the organism that first eats would be the primary consumer. And the primary consumer is always a herbivore because the primary consumer eats the producer, and the producer is always a plant. Now, whatever eats the primary consumer is considered the secondary consumer. And if there was somebody eating the secondary consumer, well, the person eating the secondary consumer would be considered the tertiary consumer. Now, this is a very simple food chain, and this food chain is a food chain that has 3 levels. And the reason why it has 3 levels is because it has 3 distinct living organisms. Producer first, the rabbit would be the 2nd level, and then our fox would be our 3rd level. Now, because our fox is on top, it has also a special name that it is the top consumer, because there is nothing else that eats the fox. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at another food chain that's going to be a little bit more complex. So in our food chain that is a little bit more complex, we still have our sun, and the sun is extremely important because all living organisms need energy to function. Now, the only living organisms that basically take solar energy and convert it into a form of food are plants, and there are certain bacteria that are able to do photosynthesis. But plants are the cornerstone to allow for animals, because animals don't make our own food. We eat others for food. So plants are extremely important because without plants, they would not be able to take the solar energy and convert it into food. And if we don't have a source of food, we do not have energy to function, we cannot be considered living. So we have in our first part of our food chain, we again have our producer. No food chain can start without a producer. And then we have our primary consumer. Because the grasshopper is eating the grass. Now, what eats the grasshopper? The mouse would be our secondary consumer. Because in the transition of all of your consumers, it is the second one in the chain. The thing that eats the mouse, which is our snake, would be our tertiary consumer. Which is basically tertiary meaning 3. So the tertiary consumer, it is the 3rd consumer in our chain. And the organism that eats the snake, which is going to be the hawk, would be our quaternary consumer, or in this case, would be considered also our top consumer. Because there is nothing else that eats the hawk. Now, if we're looking at how many levels we have in this chain, well, we just count them. The producer is 1, the grasshopper is 2, the mouse is 3, the snake is 4, the hawk is 5. So this chain has 5 levels. Now, we also have to realize that there are going to be decomposers that decompose all of our living organisms. And what's really important is that our decomposers, we don't actually count them when we're looking at our chain of events, because the mushrooms, right, so our fungi, they have the role of decomposer. They not only decompose if the hawk dies, but they would decompose if the snake dies, they would decompose the mouse, they would decompose the grasshopper. So our decomposers are basically like the recycling center of the living world, in the sense that they take the dead organic matter and they break it down, and then all of those nutrients goes back into the soil to allow the plants to utilize them to grow. So when we're talking about, and this right here is more of a web type scenario because it's all linking back to our primary producers. Okay, now our last topic that we're going to be talking about is this concept of adaptation. So when we're talking about adaptation, we're talking about how the organism has specific traits or abilities to cope with where they survive. Now, these can be physical or these can be behavioral. So when we're talking about physical, it deals with the organism's body. So this can be the amount of fur, thickness. This can be fur color. This could be the size of feet. This could be the size of teeth, so on and so forth. Right? The possibilities for physical adaptations, there are a lot of them. And if you just look at, the different beaks of different birds, they're different depending on what food source they eat. And if I'm looking at a polar bear versus a brown bear, the thickness of the fur, the color of the fur, based on where they live, based on how they can survive. Behavioral adaptations has to do with how the organism acts. So like bears hibernating in the winter because of dwindling food sources, that is a behavioral adaptation to the environment that it's in. How certain organisms only hunt at certain times of the year, or mating at certain times of the year, adapting to the conditions of where they live. So reasons why you adapt: for survival, right? You adapt to a particular area so that you can have the greatest chance to survive in that particular area. So you adapt to the climate. If the organism lives in a colder climate, it is going to have thicker fur. It is going to have darker skin colors underneath that fur to get a lot of solar energy. To their food source. If I am an organism that eats meat, I am going to have sharper teeth to get through the flesh. If I am an organism that eats seeds, I am going to have flat grinding teeth to be able to grind those food sources. How they move. A land animal based on, or an air animal, or a water-based animal is going to have different adaptations to be able to move in those different areas. How they communicate with others, and many more. There are so many ways you would adapt, but it all comes down so that you can survive. So if we're looking at our two different foxes, right? So we have our Darwin fox, we have our Arctic fox. Darwin fox lives in temperate rainforests, eats small mammals, reptiles, and vertebrates. Arctic fox lives in the Arctic. It eats voles and it also eats baby seals. Now, if I'm looking at the two pictures, the Arctic fox, much more fur than the Darwin fox, which would make sense because the Arctic fox lives in a cold climate. The Darwin fox lives in a moderately temperate climate. Temperate rainforest would be, you're looking at anywhere between 10 to 25 degrees temperature range. Arctic fox lives in the cold, so the thickness of fur is definitely one thing that's apparent. If we're looking at the ears, the Darwin fox has large ears. The Arctic fox has short ears. Has to do with body temperature. The bigger your ears, the more heat escapes from the head. The smaller the ears, the less heat escapes from the head. If we're looking at the fur color, they're white, the Arctic fox. The Darwin fox is brown and grays. to blend into where they live. So all of these adaptations are based on where they live. So another way that we have with adaptations is if we're looking at the Arctic hare. And if we're looking at the Arctic hare during 1 year, we can see in the summer that the Arctic hare is a mix of different browns. In the winter, it's completely white. Why? To adapt to its area. In the winter, it's covered mostly in snow. So the Arctic hare has a fur color so it can blend in with its environment. In the summer, when the snow is melted, you have very small amount of vegetation, and this vegetation is mostly grasses, which will be greenish and brown. So again, the fur color is changing to adapt to that reality. So this adaptation is considered camouflage. So camouflage is when the fur color blends in to the environment that it lives in. And there's a lot of different examples of camouflage. The Arctic hare is just one of them. Darwin fox also is one of them. Now, if we're looking at this image right here, I actually see two butterflies, and at first glance, they look extremely similar. They actually look like they're the exact same insect. But if I take a closer look, right here, the webbing, so my lines in my webbing are actually thick. Here, the webbing is thin. Now, if I notice right here, also the head of the butterfly. Here, it's kind of furry. Here, it's not that furry. So this is actually called mimicry. So these are actually two different butterflies. We have the viceroy butterfly and the monarch butterfly. And the viceroy butterfly is actually mimicking the monarch butterfly. The reason why? The monarch butterfly is actually very toxic for different birds to eat, whereas the viceroy butterfly is safe. But on first glance, because they look the same, the bird doesn't know if he's going to be eating something that is toxic or eating something that is safe. So most of the time, the bird does not eat the butterfly. So this is a mimicry adaptation so that you have an organism that looks like another organism that is dangerous, but it's actually not dangerous. So these are probably the two most common forms of physical adaptation that a lot of organisms in wildlife tend to apply. So this is pretty much all the terminology that we've been talking about in our series of videos. Habitat, where a species lives, population, the number of the same species that occupies that habitat, ecological niche, the place and role in a habitat where a species thrives. Our food chains is the pathway of energy in our ecosystem, and then adaptations are basically characteristics that helps organisms survive their habitat. I hope this helps, and I hope you have a great day.